Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. This request is not incidental. It situates the listener in time and place, which is precisely what this subject has always destabilized. Hastur, more accurately, Hastur, often called the Unspeakable One, does not enter literature as a monster to be confronted. It appears as a problem of interpretation, a name that changes meaning depending on who speaks it, when, and in what context. This documentary examines Hastur not as a single creation, but as an accretion. Across the late 19th and early 20th centuries, writers embedded the name within pastoral poetry, decadent fiction, forbidden drama, and cosmic horror. Each appearance added contradictions rather than clarity. That instability is the point. Hastur survives because it refuses to settle into definition. We will proceed as scholars rather than believers. The method is slow analysis, not revelation. Historical context will precede interpretation. Textual evidence will outweigh speculation. When speculation becomes unavoidable, it will be marked as such. Consider this carefully. Most of what is called Hastur emerges not from description, but from implication, from what texts withhold rather than what they disclose. This investigation will move through literary history, philosophy, psychology, and cultural afterlives. It will examine how fictional texts simulate forbidden knowledge, how symbols behave like infections, and why certain ideas persist by eroding the frameworks meant to contain them. Listening is sufficient participation. That, historically, has always been enough. The name Hastur enters literature during a period acutely preoccupied with cultural exhaustion. The late 19th century, particularly the 1880s and 1890s, saw European and American writers wrestling with the sense that inherited structures, religion, empire, reason itself, were losing authority. This atmosphere shaped the earliest appearance of the term in the work of Ambrose Bierce, whose short pieces and prose poems deploy Hastur without explanation. In Bierce's usage, the name oscillates between a pastoral deity and a place, suggesting antiquity without anchoring it. This ambiguity is deliberate. Bierce was less interested in myth-building than in destabilizing the reader's confidence that names reliably denote stable realities. When Robert W. Chambers adopted the term in The King in Yellow, 1895, the cultural stakes shifted. Chambers wrote at the height of fin de siècle decadence, when artistic circles openly theorized decline as both aesthetic and civilizational fate. His innovation was structural rather than descriptive. Hastur is never explained because explanation would reduce its function. The name circulates through references to a banned play, a ruined city, and scattered allusions that never cohere. This reveals something profound. Chambers treats horror as a property of interpretation itself. The terror lies not in what Hastur is, but in the reader's attempt to assemble meaning from fragments that resist synthesis. We must pause here to note an important distinction. Chambers did not construct a mythology in the modern sense. He constructed a failure of mythology. The play The King in Yellow is a pseudo-text whose second act is withheld, not teased. This is not narrative coyness, but a formal strategy. By refusing to complete the text, Chambers ensures that meaning is always projected by the reader. Hastur functions as a vacuum around which interpretation collapses inward. Madness in these stories is not caused by supernatural intervention, but by excessive coherence seeking. The characters break because they insist the fragments must add up to something. The early 20th century transformed this literary experiment into something closer to cosmology. H.P. Lovecraft, writing primarily between 1917 and 1937, encountered chambers through secondary references and partial understanding. His letters reveal genuine fascination paired with misinterpretation. Lovecraft assumed coherence where Chambers had cultivated contradiction. In integrating Hastur into the emerging Cthulhu mythos, he recast the name as a cosmic entity with lineage, location, and hierarchy. This move reflects Lovecraft's broader project, imposing speculative order on existential dread. Yet even here, Hastur remains unstable, slipping between God, star, and rumor. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft's systematization was not an act of closure, but of translation. He translated decadent ambiguity into cosmic insignificance. Where Chambers explored cultural decay, Lovecraft explored ontological irrelevance. Hastur survives this translation precisely because its original form was incomplete. The name absorbs new frameworks without being exhausted by them. This adaptability explains why later writers could graft Hastur onto elemental systems, alien pantheons, or psychological readings without fully resolving its meaning. The creator intent across these phases is therefore discontinuous. Bierce gestures, Chambers fractures, Lovecraft organizes. Each act reflects its historical moment. Bierce writes amid post-Civil War disillusionment. Chambers responds to aesthetic decadence and urban alienation. Lovecraft articulates interwar cosmic pessimism shaped by scientific materialism. Hastur is not X, but Y. Not a character created once, but a literary residue shaped by successive anxieties. The name persists because it was never finished. This layered origin has direct consequences for interpretation. Any attempt to read Hastur as a single, unified creation ignores the conditions that produced it. The instability is not a flaw to be corrected by canon, but the mechanism through which the concept operates. As we move forward, this historical fragmentation will matter. The next subsection examines how older, philosophical and cultural traditions supplied the raw material that made such fragmentation intelligible and unsettling to its original audience. Hastur did not emerge in an intellectual vacuum. Its early appearances coincide with a broader cultural crisis concerning meaning, progress, and human centrality. By the late 19th century, confidence in linear history and moral advancement had eroded. Industrialization reorganized daily life. Darwinian theory destabilized theological hierarchies. New psychological models challenged the unity of the self. Literature responded by turning inward, then downward. Horror, in this period, increasingly addressed not fear of external threats, but distrust of perception and interpretation. Hastur belongs to this shift. It presupposes a reader already anxious about whether meaning is discoverable at all. Philosophically, this anxiety parallels strains of pessimism circulating across Europe. The influence of Arthur Schopenhauer is indirect, but significant. His conception of the world as driven by an impersonal, indifferent will reframed suffering as structural rather than accidental. Human reason, in this view, does not master reality. It merely rationalizes pain after the fact. Hastur reflects this logic. Encounters with it do not punish moral failure. They expose futility. Knowledge does not liberate characters from dread. It clarifies why dread is unavoidable. A different but related inheritance comes from Friedrich Nietzsche, particularly the cultural consequences of what he termed the death of God. By the 1880s, this phrase described not triumph, but danger. Nietzsche warned that inherited values would persist without foundations, producing nihilism disguised as tradition. Chambers' world is saturated with this condition. Institutions remain, titles persist, monarchs, churches, and academies exist, yet none can account for themselves. Hastur operates within this vacuum. It is not worshipped in any stable sense. It is encountered as a remainder after belief collapses. The era's fascination with decadence further contextualizes this emergence. Decadent writers treated decline not as tragedy, but as aesthetic condition. Exhaustion became a style. Excess signaled refinement rather than decay. Hastur absorbs this sensibility. Carcosa is not destroyed, it is already ruined. The horror lies in recognizing that ruin can be permanent, even beautiful. This contrasts with earlier Gothic traditions, where decay implied lost greatness. Here, decay is the final state. There is no restoration implied beyond the narrative frame. Psychological discourse also reshaped how audiences understood madness. By the 1890s, degeneration theory and early psychiatry framed insanity as hereditary, progressive, and often invisible until crisis. Madness became a slow process rather than sudden possession. Chambers exploits this model precisely. Characters do not encounter Hastur and collapse immediately. They read. They reflect. They interpret. Symptoms appear gradually. This reveals something crucial. Hastur aligns with modern conceptions of mental breakdown as cumulative cognitive stress rather than supernatural invasion. Older mythic structures nevertheless remain present, though refracted. Pastoral gods, fertility cycles, and seasonal rituals inform Bierce's earliest usage. Tragic kings echo classical drama. Forbidden texts recall medieval grimoires. Yet these elements are never restored to functional systems. They appear as fragments without ritual continuity. This fragmentation mirrors how 19th century scholars encountered ancient cultures through archaeology rather than living practice. Hastur resembles a ruin studied rather than a god worshipped. Its power derives from being intellectually reconstructed rather than ritually enacted. We must pause here to clarify a common misconception. Hastur's philosophical ancestry is not mystical in origin. It is analytical. It emerges from questions about meaning, agency, and coherence raised by modernity itself. The horror does not contradict reason. It exploits reason's limits. That distinction explains why the concept resonates with educated protagonists, scholars, and artists rather than peasants or mystics. Hastur selects for interpretive ambition. These antecedents establish the conditions under which a name could function as a destabilizing force rather than a referent. As these cultural pressures converged, language itself became suspect. Words no longer guaranteed clarity. Names no longer ensured identity. This instability leads directly to the problem of language that Hastur embodies. The next subsection examines how etymology, color symbolism, and linguistic prohibition transform a simple name into a mechanism of unease. The word Hastur resists stable etymology, and this resistance is central to its function. Unlike mythological names rooted in identifiable languages or religious traditions, Hastur appears without linguistic ancestry. Bierce offers no definition. Chambers provides no clarification. Later writers speculate, but speculation replaces evidence rather than supplementing it. This absence matters. A name without origin cannot be anchored to meaning. It becomes a trigger rather than a descriptor. Hastur does not signify a being in the traditional sense. It activates an interpretive process that cannot conclude. Early readers attempted to resolve the name by analogy. Some linked it to Near Eastern storm deities. Others treated it as a corruption of Latin or Greek roots. None of these readings hold under scrutiny. There is no consistent morphology. This reveals something deliberate. Hastur is constructed to resemble a proper noun while refusing the obligations of one. It looks meaningful. It behaves like language. Yet it fails to stabilize reference. This failure produces unease because it undermines a basic assumption of reading, that words ultimately point somewhere. The designation, the Unspeakable One, intensifies this linguistic instability. Unspeakability here does not indicate sacred taboo in the religious sense. It signals a breakdown in descriptive capacity. To call something unspeakable is to acknowledge that language cannot contain it without distortion. Not X, but Y. Not forbidden because it is holy, but unspeakable because it exceeds the structures that make speech coherent. This framing transforms silence into a form of evidence. What is not said acquires analytical weight. Color symbolism further complicates this system. Yellow, in Western literary tradition, carries contradictory associations. It suggests royalty and illumination, but also disease, decay, and betrayal. By the late 19th century, yellow journalism and quarantine flags had already politicized the color. Chambers exploits this ambivalence. The yellow sign is not a single symbol. It is a convergence of meanings that never resolve. Its power lies in this convergence. Each interpretation is plausible. None is sufficient. Masks and veils recur as symbolic devices across Hastur-related texts. These are not disguises hiding a true face. They are interfaces. A mask implies that something exists beneath, but Hastur's masks proliferate without revealing an underlying essence. This reveals a structural pattern. Representation does not lead closer to truth. It multiplies surfaces. The more symbols accumulate, the less accessible meaning becomes. Language becomes recursive, folding back on itself. Textual withholding reinforces this effect. The second act of the play is never quoted. Carcosa is never mapped. Hastur is never described directly. These absences are not gaps to be filled by scholarship. They are the mechanism by which the horror operates. Readers are trained to infer. Here, inference produces instability rather than clarity. Interpretation becomes self-undermining. We must pause here to recognize the methodological implication. Hastur demonstrates how symbolic systems can generate dread without reference to external threat. Language alone suffices. Names, colors, and omissions create a feedback loop in which meaning corrodes itself. This prepares the ground for myth building that feels authentic precisely because it is incomplete. The next subsection examines how this linguistic strategy enables the construction of a mythology that simulates depth without ever resolving into canon. Hastur's durability depends on a specific strategy of myth construction, simulated depth without authoritative origin. Unlike traditional mythologies, which rely on repetition and ritual reinforcement, the Hastur corpus relies on contradiction. Texts disagree about names, locations, and hierarchies. Chronologies fracture. Sources cite other sources that do not exist. This produces a convincing illusion of antiquity. Readers recognize the pattern from real scholarship, where incomplete archives and conflicting accounts are normal. The fiction borrows the surface logic of academic uncertainty and turns it into a narrative engine. Pseudotexts play a central role in this process. The forbidden play, the lost manuscript, the marginal note. These devices mimic how knowledge often survives historically, in fragments, references, and disputed citations. Chambers' use of invented bibliographies anticipates later modernist techniques, but with a crucial difference. These references do not gesture toward a recoverable whole. they gesture toward absence. The reader is positioned as a researcher whose object of study dissolves under scrutiny. Authenticity emerges not from coherence, but from procedural familiarity. This approach mirrors 19th century encounters with antiquity. Archaeology and philology frequently reconstructed cultures from partial evidence. Scholars debated meanings without definitive resolution. Hastur adopts this method aesthetically. The myth feels ancient because it behaves like something ancient, eroded, contested, and incomplete. This reveals something profound. Authenticity in horror does not require consistency. It requires structural resemblance to how real knowledge is lost. Later expansions often misunderstood this mechanism. Efforts to systematize Hastur into taxonomies, pantheons, or moral alignments attempted to resolve ambiguity rather than preserve it. These attempts clarify details but weaken effect. Once meaning stabilizes, interpretation ceases to be dangerous. The myth becomes navigable. Hastur resists this outcome when left fragmented. Its power lies in remaining slightly illegible. Collaborative authorship further reinforces this authenticity. No single voice controls the narrative. Variations accumulate across decades. Contradictions remain unresolved. This mirrors oral tradition more than modern franchise building. Yet, unlike folklore, there is no communal consensus. Each retelling risks distortion. That risk is the point. Hastur survives through misreading. We must pause here to address a final distinction. Hastur is not a mythology that invites belief. It invites analysis. Readers are not asked to accept its reality, but to grapple with its instability. The discomfort arises when analytical tools fail to produce closure. The myth authenticates itself by defeating interpretation. This method prepares the conceptual ground for what follows. If Hastur feels real, despite lacking definition, the reason lies not in history or language alone, but in the themes it embodies. The next section examines those themes directly: insignificance, entropy, and epistemic collapse, to understand why this fragmented myth continues to exert pressure on the modern mind. At the center of Hastur-related texts lies a sustained assault on human significance. This is not the sudden annihilation familiar from apocalyptic fiction, but a slower realization that humanity was never central to begin with. Chambers' narrators do not fear extinction. They fear irrelevance. The universe continues without regard for human categories of value, morality, or meaning. This aligns with early cosmic horror philosophy, which reframes terror as cognitive dislocation rather than physical threat. The shock is intellectual. Characters discover that their assumptions about importance were never warranted. Insignificance operates structurally rather than thematically. Protagonists are often educated, articulate, and culturally embedded. Their collapse carries weight precisely because they represent interpretive authority. When such figures fail, the reader confronts a broader implication. If expertise offers no protection, then knowledge itself may be a liability. Hastur does not punish ignorance. It exploits comprehension. One fictional marginal note attributed to an unnamed scholar states, "I did not go mad because I saw too much, but because what I saw fit together." The horror emerges when coherence appears briefly, then corrodes. Entropy functions as the governing temporal principle. Unlike traditional horror, which escalates toward climax, Hastur narratives decay. Civilizations are not destroyed. They wind down. Carcosa is described as a city after its own forgetting, a phrase that collapses history into exhaustion. This reflects late 19th century anxieties about decline. Progress no longer guarantees improvement. Systems persist past usefulness, meaning thins rather than breaks. Entropy here is cultural, psychological, and epistemic. The future offers no revelation, only further dilution. Dream reality complicates this erosion by destabilizing perception. Dreams in Hastur-related texts are not escapes from reality. They are incursions. Boundaries dissolve without announcement. Characters awaken without certainty that waking represents a more stable state. This recalls fin de siècle fascination with altered consciousness and early psychoanalytic theory. But the execution differs. Dreams do not symbolize hidden desires. They overwrite reality. One passage describes a narrator realizing that the dream had weight and the waking world felt provisional. Such reversals remove any secure interpretive ground. Consider this carefully. Dream logic in these texts is not surrealist play. It is ontological sabotage. If reality behaves like a dream, then causality weakens. Memory loses authority. Identity fragments. This erosion does not culminate in spectacle. It lingers. Characters continue functioning socially while privately uncertain that their experiences belong to a shared world. Madness, in this context, is not incoherence. It is the inability to privilege one explanatory framework over another. These concepts converge through a single mechanism, epistemic overreach. Characters attempt to integrate insignificance, entropy, and dream instability into a unified worldview. The attempt itself causes collapse. Not X, but Y. Not because the universe is hostile, but because it is indifferent. Hostility invites resistance. Indifference offers no point of engagement. This distinction matters. Hastur does not oppose humanity. It bypasses it. The philosophical lineage here intersects with broader cosmic horror traditions, yet remains distinct. Lovecraft's cosmic entities emphasize scale and alien biology. Hastur emphasizes interpretive failure. The universe does not crush the mind through magnitude alone. It erodes it by rendering its tools obsolete. Logic persists, but no longer applies. Language functions, but no longer anchors meaning. Consciousness continues, but without assurance that it corresponds to anything stable. These themes establish the conditions under which entities associated with Hastur can operate. If meaning is unstable, then entities need not possess fixed form. If reality behaves like a dream, then presence becomes negotiable. The next subsection examines these entities and forces directly, not to define them conclusively, but to understand how their ambiguity functions within this philosophical framework. Entities associated with Hastur resist classification because classification itself becomes unstable within the conceptual space they occupy. Unlike mythological pantheons organized by lineage or function, these forces appear as overlapping roles rather than discrete beings. Hastur is alternately described as a god, a name, a place, or a condition. Each description contradicts the others without invalidating them. This multiplicity is not accidental. It reflects a universe in which identity cannot be fixed without distortion. Carcosa exemplifies this instability. Sometimes a ruined city beneath alien stars, sometimes a mental landscape accessed through text or dream. Carcosa refuses spatial certainty. It is not entered so much as recognized. One fictional stage direction from the forbidden play reads, "The towers were there because they had always been there." This phrasing collapses causality. Carcosa exists without origin. It behaves like memory rather than geography. The city functions as an attractor for interpretation, drawing meaning inward without ever yielding a stable referent. The king in yellow operates as an interface rather than an entity. He appears masked, costumed, or implied through absence. His role resembles that of a mimetic vector. Those who encounter him do not receive commands or revelations. They experience alignment. Thought patterns shift. Prior assumptions reorganize. This reveals something crucial. Agency remains intact, but its outputs change. Madness here is not possession. It is recalibration. The king does not act upon characters. He reframes the terms under which they act. Comparisons to Lovecraft's old ones clarify this distinction. Figures like Cthulhu exert pressure through scale and physicality. Their bodies matter. Their awakening threatens material destruction. Hastur-related forces operate differently. They threaten coherence. The Iyi, danger is not extinction, but reinterpretation. One scholar within the fiction remarks, "The city did not fall upon us. We fell into agreement with it. This agreement signals the loss of an external standard against which reality can be measured. Dreamland's beings, where present, further complicate this ecology. Dreams function as conduits rather than separate realms. Entities traverse consciousness without traversing space. This undermines the assumption that encounter requires proximity. Influence spreads through symbols, texts, and shared references. Exposure replaces contact. This model aligns with modern understandings of information contagion rather than supernatural invasion. We must pause here to address a common error. Attempts to rank these entities hierarchically misunderstand their role. Power is not exercised through dominance, but through indifference. Hastur is not supreme because it commands others. It persists because it does not require obedience. Interpretation suffices. Not X, but Y. Not a ruler issuing decrees, but a framework that renders decrees irrelevant. These forces collectively form an ecology of destabilization. Each undermines a different assumption: spatial stability, personal agency, temporal continuity, linguistic reference. Together, they produce an environment in which human cognition remains active but unreliable. Understanding does not vanish. It misfires. This prepares the ground for examining how humans interact with such forces. If entities do not attack directly, then collapse must occur elsewhere. The next subsection analyzes madness not as consequence, but as function, an adaptive response that fails precisely because it tries to adapt. Human interaction with Hastur-related forces rarely takes the form of confrontation. There is no struggle, no resistance, no moment of recognition followed by heroic refusal. Interaction occurs through interpretation. Reading, studying, staging, annotating. These are the primary modes of contact. The individuals most affected are not the vulnerable or superstitious, but the intellectually disciplined. Scholars, artists, critics, and administrators recur with notable frequency. This pattern is not incidental. Hastur selects for cognitive ambition. Madness in this context is not pathology imposed from without. It is an emergent property of sustained interpretive effort under unstable conditions. Characters attempt to reconcile contradictory data. They assume coherence must exist. This assumption drives them forward. One fictional editor writes, "The error was not curiosity. The error was believing the text intended to be understood." The moment of collapse arrives when interpretation briefly succeeds, then invalidates itself. Sanity erodes not through confusion, but through excess clarity. This reveals something crucial about function. Madness operates as a sorting mechanism. Those who abandon interpretation early remain largely unaffected. Those who persist experience transformation. The process resembles academic overspecialization taken to an extreme. Narrow focus amplifies pattern recognition beyond usefulness. Connections multiply faster than evaluative frameworks can manage them. Eventually, all information appears relevant. At that point, judgment fails. Consider this carefully. Madness here is adaptive until it is not. Heightened sensitivity initially produces insight. Characters notice alignments others miss. They anticipate events. They detect symbolic recurrence. This temporary advantage reinforces the behavior. Only later does it become clear that the framework generating insight also dissolves distinction. Everything signifies. Nothing prioritizes. Agency persists, but choice loses grounding. Social consequences follow predictably. Individuals withdraw not because they reject society, but because social norms no longer map onto their interpretive reality. Language fails to bridge the gap. Statements appear accurate, but irrelevant. One character remarks, "They spoke as if chronology still mattered." This is not delusion, it is misalignment. The speaker operates under a different set of assumptions about causality and significance. Madness also functions narratively as containment. Hastur does not spread through open evangelism. It spreads through private fixation. Each affected individual becomes isolated, reducing collective response. Institutions fail because their members fail independently. There is no shared moment of crisis, only parallel collapses that never synchronize. This fragmentation prevents resistance from cohering. Comparisons to earlier Gothic madness clarify the distinction. Traditional madness often follows transgression or guilt. It restores moral order through punishment. Hastur-related madness lacks moral dimension. There is no lesson learned. Characters are not warned away from forbidden knowledge by example. Instead, their breakdown demonstrates the cost of assuming knowledge must resolve into stable truth. We must pause here to correct a persistent misreading. Madness is not a side effect. It is the mechanism through which Hastur operates, not X, but Y. Not a consequence of exposure, but the mode of engagement itself. Interaction does not precede madness. It consists of it. To think within this framework is already to participate. This understanding reframes human agency. Characters are not victims acted upon by an external force. They are collaborators in their own destabilization. This collaboration is not chosen freely, but neither is it coerced. It arises from professional habits of mind, close reading, synthesis, inference. Skills rewarded elsewhere become liabilities here. The implications extend beyond fiction. Hastur narratives dramatize a fear specific to modern knowledge cultures, that disciplined reasoning can undermine itself when removed from stable reference. Madness becomes a mirror held up to intellectual life under conditions of informational overload and conceptual fragmentation. This leads directly to the question of forbidden knowledge. If madness emerges from interpretive persistence, then certain forms of knowledge must function as traps rather than truths. The next subsection examines how Hastur-related texts construct knowledge itself as corrosive, and how epistemic collapse replaces revelation as the final outcome. Forbidden knowledge in Hastur-related texts is not prohibited by authority. No church bans it. No state suppresses it. Access is rarely restricted. The danger lies elsewhere. Knowledge becomes forbidden because it cannot be integrated without destabilizing the structures that make knowing possible. This distinction matters. Prohibition implies power. Hastur operates through absence of control. Texts circulate freely. The cost is discovered only after engagement. The forbidden play exemplifies this mechanism. Readers are not warned away by explicit threats. Instead, they are assured of artistic value, historical importance, or philosophical depth. Curiosity is justified. One fictional annotation notes, "It promised coherence, and I believed it." The betrayal occurs when coherence arrives briefly, then collapses. The second act does not reveal hidden truth. It reframes the act of reading itself as participation. At that moment, the reader recognizes that knowledge has shifted from object to process. Epistemic collapse follows a recognizable pattern. First, interpretive confidence increases. Connections align. Contradictions appear meaningful rather than problematic. Then, explanatory frameworks proliferate. No single model suffices, but all seem partially correct. Finally, prioritization fails. Without criteria for relevance, judgment erodes. Knowledge does not disappear. It becomes unusable. The mind remains active, but directionless. This is not ignorance. It is saturation. Consider this carefully. Epistemic collapse is not sudden. It is cumulative. Characters do not realize the cost of knowledge until after assimilation. This mirrors real scholarly processes, where years of study precede paradigm crisis. Hastur dramatizes this moment by compressing it. One character reflects, "I had answers for everything, and therefore none at all." The paradox signals total explanatory failure. Language plays a critical role in this collapse. Words retain grammatical function, but lose anchoring. Terms like before, after, cause, and identity persist, yet no longer correspond reliably to experience. This produces a specific anxiety distinct from madness as incoherence. Thought remains ordered, sentences make sense, conclusions follow premises. The problem is that premises no longer refer to a shared reality. Knowledge becomes internally consistent, but externally unmoored. Comparisons to theological forbidden knowledge clarify the uniqueness of this model. In religious narratives, forbidden knowledge often concerns moral, transgression, or divine secrets. The punishment restores cosmic order. Hastur offers no restoration. There is no moral violation to correct. The collapse does not serve justice. It exposes the fragility of epistemic systems themselves. Not X, but Y. Not knowledge that reveals too much, but knowledge that reveals the insufficiency of revelation. We must pause here to address the role of scholarship within the fiction. Academic methods, citation, comparison, contextualization, are faithfully reproduced. Footnotes appear, authorities are invoked, disputes are recorded. These familiar practices lend credibility, yet they also accelerate collapse. Each clarification generates further uncertainty. Scholarship becomes recursive. Research no longer narrows questions, it multiplies them. This mechanism explains why Hastur persists across media and eras. Forbidden knowledge here is not content-specific. It adapts to context. What matters is structure. Any system promising total explanation becomes vulnerable. The more comprehensive the framework, the more catastrophic its failure when confronted with irreducible ambiguity. The final implication is unsettling. Hastur suggests that some ideas do not corrupt because they are false, but because they are incomplete in a way that invites endless completion. The mind, trained to resolve, cannot stop trying. Collapse is not imposed, it is reached. This concludes the examination of Hastur's thematic core. We have established a philosophical environment defined by insignificance, entropy, interpretive instability, and corrosive knowledge. These themes do not remain abstract. They manifest concretely in specific texts. The next part turns to literary case studies, tracing how these concepts take narrative form. and how individual stories enact epistemic failure in detail. The earliest appearances of Hastur are notable not for what they describe, but for how little they commit. In Ambrose Bierce's short prose piece, Haida, the Shepherd, first published in the 1890s, Hastur appears as a pastoral god associated with shepherds, flutes, and rural calm. There is no menace. The tone is elegiac. This matters. Bierce introduces the name as residue from a forgotten belief system, not as a threat. Hastur enters literature already displaced. It exists as a memory of worship rather than an active object of fear. This initial framing establishes a pattern that later texts exploit. Hastur is never introduced at the center of attention. It appears peripherally, almost casually, embedded in songs, marginal references, or half-remembered myths. Bierce treats the name as something assumed to be known, even if the reader does not know it. This rhetorical move creates artificial depth. The reader infers a missing archive. The technique resembles genuine mythological reference, where names survive longer than their meanings. The decisive transformation occurs with Robert W. Chambers, The King, in Yellow, 1895. Chambers fractures Bierce's pastoral residue and redistributes it across unrelated stories. Hastur becomes a place, a force, and a forbidden association without fixed boundaries. In The Repairer of Reputations, a character casually notes, "It is a strange thing that the King in Yellow should have left no written record of his reign." The sentence presumes a history that does not exist. This presumption forces the reader into complicity, filling gaps that cannot be filled. Chambers' most significant innovation is intertextual dependency. No single story explains the myth. Meaning emerges only through accumulation. References echo across stories without resolution. The yellow sign appears repeatedly, but its function shifts. Carcosa is mentioned, but never located. The play is quoted, but only partially. Each appearance slightly alters context, preventing stabilization. The reader becomes a synthesizer, attempting to assemble a coherent mythology from incompatible fragments. Consider this carefully. Chambers' stories do not contradict each other accidentally. They contradict by design. One character insists Carcosa lies by the shores of the Lake of Hali. Another implies it exists beyond time. These cannot both be true in conventional terms. Yet the text does not choose between them. Instead, contradiction becomes evidence of depth. The myth feels old because it behaves like a corrupted archive. Theatricality further complicates these connections. The play, The King in Yellow, functions as a negative center, linking disparate narratives. Characters who read it undergo transformation, but the transformation varies. Some descend into delusion, others gain disturbing clarity. This variability resists moral framing. The play does not punish uniformly. It destabilizes according to context. Narrative causality weakens. Exposure does not guarantee outcome. Later writers, particularly H.P. Lovecraft, encountered these fragments secondhand. Lovecraft references Hastur obliquely in stories like The Whisperer in Darkness, 1931, associating the name with cosmic entities and alien locations. Importantly, he never resolves Chambers' contradictions. Instead, he overlays them with new ones. Hastur becomes both an old one and something adjacent to the mythos. This layering preserves instability while expanding scope. Intertext connections thus operate across decades rather than within a single canon. Bierce supplies the name. Chambers supplies the fracture. Lovecraft supplies cosmological context without closure. Later authors inherit a structure defined by absence. The concept evolves not through clarification, but through accretion. Each edition increases interpretive load without resolving earlier tensions. This evolution matters because it demonstrates how Hastur survives literary transmission. It is not protected by consistency. It is protected by ambiguity that invites scholarly reconstruction while defeating it. The myth grows sideways, not forward. Understanding this process prepares us to examine individual stories in detail. The next subsection turns to a focused case study, analyzing how one narrative enacts epistemic collapse at the level of character, structure, and form. The repairer of reputations functions as the most analytically dense entry point into the Hastur corpus, because it embeds cosmic horror within a rigorously constructed psychological frame. Published in 1895 as the opening story of The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers, it presents itself initially as alternate history. The year is 1920. The United States has become a semi-monarchical republic. The premise appears political, even satirical. This surface normality is crucial. Chambers withholds overt horror until interpretive habits are firmly established. The narrator, Hildred Castaigne, is not introduced as insane. He is articulate, educated, and meticulous. His references to historical documents, legal reforms, and literary works simulate scholarly rigor. Only gradually do fractures appear. Castaigne casually claims lineage to the throne. He discusses assassination as administrative necessity. These claims are not framed as delusions within the text. They are narrated as reasonable conclusions. This narrative choice forces the reader into epistemic evaluation. Is the world distorted, or is the narrator? The answer is deferred through textual layering. Castaigne frequently quotes The King in Yellow, treating it as authoritative. One passage reads, "I remember the first time I read the play. It left an indelible impression, like a bright light seen too long." The metaphor is precise. Overexposure damages perception without immediate pain. The play does not implant madness. It recalibrates standards of plausibility. After reading, Castaigne's conclusions follow logically from altered premises. Chambers reinforces this instability through contradictory documentary evidence. Marginal notes from Mr. Wilde, the titular repairer, appear to validate Castaigne's beliefs. Yet Wilde himself occupies an ambiguous position. He may be a co-conspirator, a manipulator, or a projection. The text never resolves this. Each possibility remains structurally viable. Interpretation becomes recursive. Every attempt to diagnose delusion generates further uncertainty. Consider this carefully. The story never confirms whether the alternate history is false. The United States may indeed have shifted politically. The assassination plot may be sanctioned. What collapses is not reality, but confidence in evaluative frameworks. The reader cannot determine which sources within the story are reliable because reliability itself lacks an external anchor. Madness emerges as a property of the narrative system rather than a character flaw. The yellow sign appears briefly, yet decisively. It is described without explanation, functioning as recognition rather than revelation. Those who know, know. Those who do not, cannot infer meaning. This selective intelligibility mirrors academic specialization taken to an extreme. Knowledge becomes isolating. Castaigne's isolation is not social withdrawal, but epistemic solitude. He inhabits a coherent worldview that cannot be shared. This story establishes several enduring functions within the Hastur mythos. First, it demonstrates that horror can be achieved without supernatural spectacle. Second, it frames madness as interpretive success carried too far. Third, It positions forbidden texts as epistemic instruments rather than narrative MacGuffins. The repairer of reputations does not warn against curiosity. It warns against assuming that coherence guarantees truth. As a case study, the story reveals how Hastur operates at the level of narrative logic. The collapse is quiet, procedural, and internally consistent. No revelation occurs, only recognition. This model becomes foundational. Later stories will adapt its mechanisms in different genres and media. The next subsection examines another central text, focusing on absence rather than narration, and how the withheld second act of The King in Yellow becomes the most influential scene never written. The most influential text in the Hastur corpus is one that does not exist. The King in Yellow, the play within Chambers' collection, functions as an absent center around which all other narratives orbit. Its first act is occasionally quoted. Its second act is never reproduced. This asymmetry is deliberate. The play is not a story to be read, but a mechanism to be inferred. Its power derives from structured absence rather than content. Descriptions of the first act emphasize conventional tragedy. Characters, motives, and conflicts appear legible. One quoted line: "Along the shore the cloud waves break, the twin suns sink behind the lake," establishes atmosphere without destabilizing form. The language is ornate but intelligible. Readers are invited to expect coherence. The second act violates that expectation. Characters who read it experience irreversible cognitive shift. Importantly, the nature of that shift varies. Some become withdrawn, others gain unsettling confidence. This variability signals that the play does not impose belief. It dissolves interpretive safeguards. Consider this carefully. The second act is never summarized because summary would stabilize it. Chambers instead records effects. One character states simply, "Afterward, I could no longer tell which thoughts were mine." The sentence offers no spectacle, only consequence. The horror lies in the loss of ownership over cognition. Identity remains intact enough to notice its own erosion. This is epistemic collapse, rendered as literary technique. The theatrical frame intensifies this effect. Theater implies audience, performance, repetition. Yet the play resists communal experience. Those who read it do so privately or in small groups. There is no stable production history. Each reading becomes a unique event. This undermines the assumption that texts produce consistent interpretations, meaning fractures across readers. No authoritative staging exists to fix interpretation. Narratively, the play functions as a filter. Characters who encounter it are sorted, not transformed uniformly. Those already inclined toward synthesis collapse faster. Others linger in partial understanding. This sorting mechanism mirrors the madness function discussed earlier. Exposure is not equal. Susceptibility depends on interpretive habits rather than moral character or emotional fragility. The play also reconfigures time. References suggest that Carcosa exists both before and after the events described. One stage direction reportedly reads, "Time itself was a tattered mask." This line collapses chronology into costume. Events no longer proceed. They recur, overlap, or stagnate. Readers lose confidence in narrative sequence. Cause and effect blur without vanishing entirely. The result is not chaos, but suspended intelligibility. Comparisons to other forbidden texts clarify the innovation. Unlike grimoires that promise power or revelation, The King in Yellow promises nothing explicitly. Its danger is not temptation. It is misalignment. Readers are not seduced by forbidden content. They are destabilized by structural betrayal. the text behaves like literature until it does not. We must pause here to address a common misinterpretation. The play is not a metaphor for insanity alone. It is a critique of interpretive expectation. Readers assume that texts reward effort with meaning. This assumption is weaponized. The play's second act reveals that some texts punish comprehension itself. The enduring influence of this absent text lies in its portability. Later authors, filmmakers, and game designers reproduce the structure rather than the content. A missing chapter, a corrupted file, an unreleased level. The absence becomes the horror. By refusing to fill the gap, these adaptations preserve the original function. As a case study, The King in Yellow demonstrates that withholding can be more destabilizing than disclosure. It establishes absence as a narrative tool capable of generating dread without description. This technique becomes central to later expansions of the mythos. The next subsection examines how subsequent writers attempted to extend Hastur's presence and what was gained, or lost, when ambiguity encountered systematization. The expansion of Hastur beyond chambers marks a shift from literary experiment to shared mythology. This transition occurs unevenly, often through misreading rather than deliberate continuation. H.P. Lovecraft plays a pivotal role, though his engagement with Hastur is fragmentary. In stories like The Whisperer in Darkness, 1931, Hastur is mentioned alongside cosmic entities and distant stars, implying ontological status without elaboration. Lovecraft's references function as connective tissue rather than exposition. He treats Hastur as a known quantity, despite lacking direct textual foundation. This assumption becomes contagious. The most consequential reinterpretation arrives with August Derleth, writing primarily in the 1940s and 1950s. Derleth sought to organize Lovecraft's loosely connected entities into a coherent system. Elemental alignments, moral polarities, and hierarchical structures appear. Hastur is recast as an heir-associated Great Old One, sometimes opposed to Cthulhu. This move clarifies relationships, but alters function. Ambiguity gives way to taxonomy. Horror shifts from epistemic instability to mythological conflict. This reveals a tension inherent in collaborative myth-making. Expansion promises accessibility. Systems invite participation. Yet systematization reduces interpretive risk. Once entities possess fixed attributes, interaction becomes predictable. The reader no longer confronts uncertainty at the level of meaning. Instead, they navigate lore. Hastur becomes legible. The cost is subtle but significant. What was once unsettling because it resisted comprehension now rewards familiarity. Later writers respond unevenly to this inheritance. Some embrace Derleth's structure, treating Hastur as a defined antagonist. Others deliberately revert to Chambers' ambiguity. Modern authors often fragment continuity intentionally, reintroducing contradiction as corrective. Hastur appears as rumor, symbol, or psychological condition rather than character. These approaches acknowledge that the concept functions best when incomplete. Cross-media adaptations further complicate the picture. Role-playing games, particularly those emerging in the late 20th century, formalize mechanics for madness and forbidden knowledge. Hastur becomes playable, quantifiable. This risks neutralization, yet also introduces new audiences to the underlying ideas. The success of these adaptations depends on restraint. When rules simulate uncertainty rather than eliminate it, the original effect partially survives. We must pause here to clarify a crucial point. Collaborative expansion does not inherently weaken the myth. The problem arises when expansion seeks resolution rather than variation. Hastur tolerates addition, but resists closure. Not X, but Y, not growth through explanation, but growth through divergence. The most effective later contributions understand this and allow contradictions to persist. The evolution of Hastur across authors demonstrates a rare case where misunderstanding becomes productive. Each writer inherits fragments and assembles them differently. No version supersedes the others. Instead, they coexist uneasily. This uneasy coexistence mirrors the internal logic of the myth itself. Stability would be thematically inconsistent. This concludes the examination of literary manifestations. We have traced Hastur from marginal name to absent text to contested mythos. At each stage, meaning expands without settling. The next part turns outward, examining how these literary mechanisms escape fiction and reappear in culture, psychology, and modern myth-making. Often in forms that blur the line between analysis and belief. The cultural afterlife of Hastur reveals a pattern distinct from conventional fandom. Rather than producing clear legends, it generates contested rumors. Claims circulate about suppressed editions of The King in Yellow, missing second acts, or private performances witnessed by small audiences who refuse to describe them. These stories are rarely asserted as fact in a straightforward sense. They are framed as possibly, supposedly, or according to someone who was there. This hedging is not caution. It is structural. The rumor preserves ambiguity as its core feature. Hoaxes play a productive role in this ecosystem. Fabricated marginalia, invented academic papers, and forged correspondence appear online and occasionally in print. These artifacts mimic scholarly form, convincingly enough to invite investigation, but not convincingly enough to settle questions. The pleasure lies in uncertainty. Debunking never fully satisfies because the hoax behaves like the fiction it imitates. Even when exposed, it leaves behind interpretive residue. The question is no longer whether it is true, but why it felt plausible. Urban legends surrounding Hastur differ from traditional supernatural sightings. There are no recurring visual descriptions. Instead, accounts emphasize experiences of recognition. Individuals claim to have realized something after encountering a symbol, phrase, or performance. The content of that realization remains private. This privacy is crucial. It prevents communal verification while reinforcing personal conviction. The experience cannot be disproven because it makes no external claim. Digital culture intensifies this pattern. Internet forums, ARGs, and collaborative storytelling platforms encourage distributed myth-making. Participants contribute fragments without coordination. Contradictions accumulate. Attempts to impose coherence are often rejected by the community. Hastur thrives in this environment because it aligns with decentralized authorship. No single version dominates. Authority dissolves into participation. Consider this carefully. These modern myths do not attempt to convince skeptics. They reward those already inclined to interpret. Engagement becomes the threshold. Once engaged, withdrawal feels like loss of insight. This mirrors the original literary mechanism. Exposure precedes belief. Belief remains optional, but curiosity becomes difficult to relinquish. Comparisons to earlier occult hoaxes clarify the distinction. Traditional hoaxes aim to deceive. Hastur-related hoaxes aim to unsettle. Success is measured not by belief, but by sustained attention. The hoax persists even after revelation, because revelation does not resolve its function. Not X, but Y. Not deception that collapses when exposed, but ambiguity that survives exposure. We must pause here to address why claims of real sightings persist despite lacking evidence. These sightings rarely describe entities. They describe moments of cognitive disturbance, lost time, altered interpretation, sudden pattern recognition. Such experiences are common. Hastur provides a narrative container for them. The myth offers language without explanation. It names without defining. This persistence reflects a broader human tendency. When experiences resist integration into shared frameworks, people seek symbolic anchors rather than empirical ones. Hastur supplies an anchor that does not demand belief, only acknowledgement. The result is a category of modern myth that functions less like folklore and more like shared unease. These myths, hoaxes, and sightings demonstrate that Hastur's influence no longer depends on literature alone. It is migrated into cultural practice. The next subsection examines how this migration occurs through film, games, and music, and what changes when ambiguity is translated into sensory media. When Hastur migrates into visual and interactive media, it encounters a structural problem. Ambiguity is difficult to render without collapsing into explanation. Film, games, and music must therefore adapt the mechanism rather than the content. Successful adaptations do not show Hastur. They reproduce the conditions under which interpretation destabilizes. Failure occurs when imagery replaces inference. Television provides a clear example. The first season of True Detective never depicts Hastur directly, yet saturates its narrative with Carcosa, the Yellow King, and ritualized language. These elements function as narrative contaminants rather than plot drivers. Viewers are encouraged to assemble meaning from fragments that ultimately refuse synthesis. The case resolves. The cosmology does not. The result mirrors Chambers' strategy: closure at the level of story, openness at the level of implication. Games adapt the myth more explicitly, but with mixed results. Tabletop role-playing systems often codify madness and forbidden knowledge as mechanics. This risks neutralization. However, certain designs preserve uncertainty by limiting information asymmetrically. Players encounter incomplete documents, contradictory testimonies, and unreliable outcomes. Progress occurs, but understanding regresses. The game advances while meaning fragments. This inversion preserves the original function: engagement without mastery. Video games face greater constraints. Visual representation tempts designers to reveal. The most effective titles resist this by embedding horror in environment and implication. Corrupted textures, looping architecture, and incomplete narratives replace monsters. One recurring device is the inaccessible area, visible but unreachable, suggesting significance without granting access. This echoes the absent second act of the play. The player knows something matters. They cannot reach it. Music offers a different pathway. Because it lacks explicit semantic content, it can invoke Hastur's effects without explanation. Lyrics fragment. Motifs recur without resolution. Dissonance replaces melody. Several experimental and metal subgenres employ yellow imagery, fractured time signatures, and references to unspeakable kings. The effect is atmospheric rather than narrative. Listeners report unease without identifiable cause. This aligns closely with the original literary aim: affect preceding comprehension. We must pause here to note a recurring pattern. Adaptations succeed when they preserve procedural ambiguity. They fail when they substitute lore for uncertainty. Explanatory codices, encyclopedic backstories, and explicit visualizations reduce interpretive pressure. The audience becomes consumer rather than participant. Consider this carefully. Hastur persists in modern media not because creators replicate Chambers' texts, but because they replicate his refusal to explain. The most effective adaptations frustrate audiences accustomed to resolution. They reward attention without satisfying it. Not X, but Y. Not horror through spectacle, but horror through withheld coherence. This strategy reflects broader shifts in media consumption. Audiences increasingly encounter fragmented narratives, unreliable information, and competing interpretations. Hastur adapts easily to this environment. It does not require belief. It requires patience with uncertainty. Media that respect this requirement extend the myth without exhausting it. These adaptations demonstrate that Hastur can survive translation across sensory forms, provided its core mechanism remains intact. The next subsection examines how this survival extends into subcultures and academic discourse, where analysis itself becomes a site of participation rather than distance. Hastur's migration into subcultural spaces reveals a paradox. The more seriously it is analyzed, the more it begins to function. Online communities devoted to cosmic horror, alternate reality games, and experimental fiction often treat Hastur less as a character and more as a methodological reference. Discussions focus on structure, ambiguity, and narrative failure rather than lore. Participants share fragments, citations, invented footnotes, corrupted texts, without attempting synthesis. Authority is deliberately unstable. This mirrors the original literary mechanism. Interpretation becomes collaborative, but never conclusive. ARG communities provide a particularly clear example. Hastur-themed projects often avoid puzzles with definitive solutions. Instead, they offer trails that fork endlessly. Clues contradict earlier clues. Documents reference events that cannot be verified. Participants debate authenticity without expecting resolution. Engagement replaces outcome. The game does not end. It disperses. This dispersal aligns with the myth's core logic, meaning spreads by fragmentation rather than accumulation. Academic engagement follows a different but related pattern. Literary scholars approach Hastur through lenses such as postmodernism, semiotics, and memetics. Papers analyze the play as a self-reflexive text that undermines readerly expectation. Others examine Hastur as an early model of information contagion. These readings do not settle interpretation. They multiply it. Each framework illuminates one aspect while obscuring others. Scholarship becomes additive rather than corrective. Consider this carefully. Hastur resists totalizing theory. Structuralist readings fail to stabilize symbols. Psychoanalytic readings over-personalize what remains impersonal. Historicist approaches explain origin without exhausting effect. This resistance produces an unusual scholarly humility. Analysts acknowledge limits. Footnotes proliferate. Conclusions hedge. The tone shifts from mastery to containment. This is rare in literary criticism. Subcultures often appropriate academic language deliberately. Fake conference proceedings circulate. Mock dissertations appear online. These are not satire alone. They test the boundary between analysis and participation. When does studying the myth become part of it? The line blurs because the myth rewards analytical behavior with further ambiguity. Research does not close the system, it feeds it. We must pause here to address a broader implication. Hastur functions as a model for how information behaves in contemporary culture. Disinformation spreads not because it convinces, but because it invites interpretation. Competing explanations coexist. Certainty becomes suspect. Hastur anticipated this dynamic by more than a century. Not X, but Y. Not belief that dominates, but ambiguity that persists. This persistence explains why Hastur appears in graduate seminars and internet forums with equal ease. Both environments value interpretation, citation, and debate. Both risk overinvestment. Hastur exposes a shared vulnerability, the assumption that analysis leads toward closure. Here, it does not. These appropriations demonstrate that Hastur's afterlife depends less on horror fandom than on interpretive culture itself. Wherever people analyze fragments under conditions of uncertainty, the structure reappears. The next and final subsection examines why this structure remains psychologically compelling and what it suggests about the enduring limits of human understanding. Hastur endures because it exploits a structural vulnerability rather than a cultural trend. Human cognition is oriented toward coherence. We seek patterns, hierarchies, and explanations that stabilize experience. Hastur offers patterns without hierarchy and explanations without closure. The mind engages fully, yet receives no terminal reward. This produces a specific unease distinct from fear. It is the discomfort of unresolved cognition, where effort does not yield mastery. Psychologically, this aligns with research on ambiguity tolerance and cognitive load. Individuals can sustain uncertainty temporarily, but prolonged exposure without resolution generates anxiety. Hastur narratives extend this exposure indefinitely. There is no final interpretive release. The reader adapts by normalizing instability. Over time, uncertainty becomes the default condition rather than an anomaly. This adaptation mirrors modern informational environments, where contradictory data streams coexist without authoritative arbitration. Consider this carefully. Hastur does not suggest that truth is inaccessible. It suggests that access does not guarantee usability. Knowledge accumulates, but synthesis fails. This distinction matters. It reframes despair not as ignorance, but as surplus. The horror emerges when there is too much to know, and no reliable method for prioritization. The mind remains active, but directionless. Philosophically, Hastur occupies a space adjacent to existentialism, without offering its consolations. Existential thought acknowledges meaninglessness, then seeks authenticity in response. Hastur offers no such project. Recognition does not enable action. Insight does not restore agency. One fictional line captures this impasse. Understanding arrived, and with it, the certainty that nothing followed. The sentence refuses progression. It ends where it begins. Comparisons to other cosmic horror traditions clarify the uniqueness. Where Lovecraft emphasizes scale and alien materiality, Hastur emphasizes interpretive exhaustion. The universe is not hostile. It is unresponsive. Not X, but Y. Not a cosmos that crushes human aspiration, but one that ignores it entirely. Indifference proves more corrosive than opposition because it offers no terms of engagement. We must pause here to acknowledge a final implication. Hastur persists because it models a limit condition of thought itself. It asks what happens when analytical tools succeed too well, revealing their own insufficiency. The resulting unease is not tied to any era. It recurs whenever systems promise total explanation and fail to deliver it. This is why Hastur remains difficult to dismiss. It does not demand belief. It invites reflection that cannot conclude. Once encountered, the structure lingers, not as conviction, but as doubt about the reliability of interpretation itself. There is no final synthesis to offer here. Any attempt would contradict the material under examination. Hastur does not resolve into lesson or warning. It remains as an open question embedded in cultural memory, a reminder that some ideas do not end. They persist by continuing to think through us.